In the time that I lived in Sri Lanka, I spent a lot of time visiting various forest monasteries and hermitages, and sometimes just spent a few days in some forest caves. I was never what was called Aranya Hamdaru, a forest monk, spending extended periods in forest, but I did spend a lot of time in forest, firstly to visit these meditation centers and sometimes stay for a week or two, or sometimes there was just a beautiful forest area nearby and I had the opportunity to meander through it. And one of the things I remember with great fondness is my occasional encounter with the wonderful wildlife of Sri Lanka, which, despite being in decline and the rapid disappearance of forest in the country, there is still sufficient areas that are quite wild and untouched. In fact, in the years that I was in Sri Lanka, there was really only two animals living there which I never saw. One was the loris, the very small, I don't know what you'd call it, a monkey-like creature with large eyes, usually only come out at night. I never encountered one of those. And the other one was the leopard. I had close encounters with leopards, but I never actually saw one. And I know many forest monks told me that they did often see them, but I never did. But I'd just like to share with you some experiences I had with animals. So once one of the books I wrote on sacred places in Sri Lanka, I had a chapter on the cave monasteries of Sri Lanka, which date right from the beginning of the introduction of Buddhism in the 2nd century BC, 2nd or 3rd century BC. And you can always tell where these rock caves are because to prepare one to live in, it was necessary to cut a ledge along the top so that when it rained and the rain came down on the rock, it would drip off rather than seep under the cave where a monk would want to live. And so as you're going through the forest, sometimes you see very clearly a rain-worn part of the rock and then a line with it lighter because that part of the rock hasn't been stained by the rain over the centuries. So it was quite easy to find these places. And of course, in some of them, monks are still living, but in some cases, animals are living in them, specifically leopards, bears, and porcupines. Anyway, in the Visuddhimagga, it mentions that the best cave to meditate in is the Chula Naga Lena. And I thought, well, it would be wonderful if one could find this place. Now, when devotees were preparing a cave for a monk, they would cut one of these ledges, and then underneath the ledge, they would give their name. This cave was donated by so-and-so. Or sometimes they would give the year of the king in which they had made this cave. Or sometimes they gave their name and the year of the reign of the present king, and then the name of the cave. Now the great archaeologist, Sri Lankan archaeologist Simon Paramanitana did a very detailed account of all of these inscriptions on these caves. So I got a copy of that great archaeological study, and sure enough, there it mentions the Chula Naga cave. In actual fact, there's actually an inscription giving the name of it. So it also gave the details of how to get there. So I thought, well, I'd really like to go and see that cave. If Buddhaghosa was correct, this was, at least during his time, it was considered the best cave to meditate in. So it happened to be in quite an insecure area. in the northern part of Sri Lanka, far north of Anuradhapura, which was an insecure area because the Tamil Tigers were operating there at that time. Anyway, with great difficulty, I made my way there, and I asked the monk in the local temple if he knew where this cave was, and he'd never heard of it before. So I looked around and what have you, and I had a photocopy of the inscription. So I knew that if I found a cave and the inscription on the drip ledge was the same as in the book, that I'd found the right cave, and indeed I did find it. The problem was that it had been abandoned probably for centuries, and there was a very thorny bush growing at the entrance of the cave, so there was no way that I could possibly get into it. However, on one side there was another rock, and I realized that if I climbed onto that rock, I might be able to slide into the cave, or at least into the mouth of the cave. So being a rather stupid monk, I decided to try that, and I climbed onto the thing, and I looked in, and I could see the cave was relatively empty inside. So I slided down, only to find that I had frightened the wits out of a family of porcupines. And porcupines generally will avoid you if they possibly can. But if you suddenly, quite unexpectedly, fall into their home, generally they don't like it. So these three porcupines sort of were startled, and they opened their quills very close to me, and there was no way I could get out of the cave, because I found that I couldn't climb up on the rock that I had slid down on, and I couldn't leave the cave because there was this great thorny bush there. So really the only thing I could do was keep perfectly still. After a few minutes, although it felt like several hours, the porcupines calmed down a little bit and gradually moved away, and that allowed me with great difficulty to climb back up onto this rock and emerge from the Chula Naga Lena. On another occasion, myself and another monk, we were climbing up a very large rocky mountain some 3 or 4 kilometers from Mahintale in northern Sri Lanka, just to get a fine view, looking over Mahintale, because on the top of Mahintale there is quite a beautiful stupa, and we thought that if we could have a look at it from a distance, it would be a pleasure to see. So we climbed with great difficulty over boulders and rocks and bushes and vines, and we got to the top, and sure enough there was a ledge, an earthen ledge, and then a deep dark cave. And because it was a hot day and we were rather tired, having clambered up this hill, we sat on this ledge for a few minutes, catching our breath and looking out on the view. And then it occurred to me that there was a particular smell and I asked my companion, "What's that smell?" And I kept on trying to identify that smell, and finally identified it's the type of smell you experience when you stand in front of the lion's cage or the leopard's cage at a zoo. It's a sort of a feline smell. And then I looked down on the ledge we were sitting on, and I noticed that it had been padded smooth. Something had been obviously often walking on this area. So then both my companion and I looked into the darkness of the cave, and we heard a particularly angry hissing sound. And it was immediately obvious that we were very close to a very angry leopard. We never actually saw him. Anyway, it's amazing how quickly you can recover from your exhaustion when you know that there's a leopard just nearby. We jumped up and we clambered down that hill as fast as we could go and arrived at the bottom, scratched and bleeding, but very thankful to be away. That was my only close encounter with a leopard in all that time. But one creature that I encountered quite often, and I always found a great delight to encounter, was elephants. There is still a good-sized population of elephants in Sri Lanka, and sometimes they live quite near human habitation. And somewhere between Anuradhapura and Polonnaruwa, there was a very high mountain called Ritigala. And it is so high that there is actually a microclimate on the top. So it's very high and not surrounded by any other mountains, so that it has this distinct separate climate on the top, and types of vegetation grow there that don't grow in other places nearby. It's quite a majestic mountain. Anyway, at the foot of this mountain there is a forest monastery called Ritigala, with some very, very nice monks who live there in great, in solitude, in simplicity, and who have very little contact with outsiders. They just do their meditation there and live very, very simply. And I had visited there before and I wanted to go again. So I got off the main road, and I wasn't quite sure how to get there because the forest is quite thick. But there was a villager nearby, and the young son offered to show me the path to the monastery, to the hermitage. So as we were walking along, after a while we came to an open area where on one side of which was a large flat rock face, and all around there was no grass growing. It was dusty, and there was elephants' droppings everywhere, and that very distinct pachyderm smell of elephants. And I asked the boy what this was, and he told me that it's the elephant's scratching rock, meaning that apparently elephants come there and they scratch themselves against this flat rock. So I went and had a look at it, and sure enough, I could actually even see some elephant's hairs stuck to the rock. So we walked on a little further, and we came to a branch in the path, and my guide told me that if you go that way, after a while you'll get to the hermitage. So I thanked him, he left, and then I thought I'd really like to see the elephants scratching themselves on that rock. So I went back to this rock and I looked around, and I realized that just nearby was another quite high rock, and that if I was able to climb to the top of that rock, I could stay there at night and maybe the elephants would come and I would see them. So I went around the back of it, and actually it was fairly easy to climb to the top of this rock. It was flat on the top. I made myself comfortable. I spent an hour meditating or something, and sooner or later the sun went down, and I just sat there very quietly, not necessarily meditating, but just being meditative and calm. As it happened, it was a moonlit night. It wasn't a full moon, but there was enough light to see. And sure enough, at a certain time, I don't know what it was because I didn't have a watch, an elephant turned up, and then two elephants turned up, and they communicated with each other for a few minutes, and then one went over and scratched himself against the rock. He put his butt against the rock and scratched it and made sounds of groaning, delight sounds and whatever. And then another one came, and it was just wonderful. I think they sensed me because at one point they put up their trunks, and I imagine they sensed that I was there, but they couldn't see me, so they weren't alarmed. And after some time of watching them, another elephant, a much bigger one, came, and it was very interesting because his tusks were very noticeable. His white ivory tusks were very noticeable in the moonlight, and that he had only one tusk. And I noticed that the others moved out of the way to make room for him. Anyway, this went on for such time, and I found it a wonderful experience to be so close to these animals and watch them the way they behaved. Later on, I fell asleep there. I woke up in the morning, and I climbed down and made my way to the hermitage. And the local hamdaru, the abbot, asked me where I'd come from and how long I was staying for. And I told him, and he said, well, I mentioned to him that I wouldn't mind climbing to the top of Ritigala and seeing what it was like up there. And he told me, well, be careful because there are a lot of animals in the area. And in particular, there's one bull elephant with only one tusk, and he's already killed 3 people, so make sure you avoid him. So that was my experience with elephants at Ritigala. And then once again, not that far from Anuradhapura, there's a place called Mineria, which is quite famous for its elephants. It's a large man-made reservoir made by one of the ancient kings. And there's a great deal of nice grass growing there, and at certain times of the year when the water level drops a little bit, the grass grows up and large herds of elephants come here to feed. But just near the town, above the town, is a hill called Nagalakanda. And I was told that there were some ancient ruins on this hill. So one day when I was nearby, I went to visit, and indeed there were some quite interesting ruins there. And then there appeared to be an ancient path, or an ancient road maybe, going further up the hill. So I thought I'll follow that and see where it goes. Now, it hadn't rained very much that year, and it was in the summertime. So what happens in South Asian forests in the summertime is the trees lose their leaves. And this year they lost more of their leaves because it was particularly dry. So as I was walking up the hill, I was walking through maybe 6 inches or sometimes 8 inches of dried leaves. And this triggered a memory of me when I was a kid. During the autumn time, where I lived, there were a lot of trees along the side of the roads, and I used to enjoy walking through the dried leaves, the dead leaves, listening to the crackling sound as I kicked them and walked on them. It's a childhood memory. So I started doing that, just sort of looking down and feeling the cracking of the leaves under my feet and what have you. And as I proceeded, I was quite absorbed in this. And at one point I looked up, and almost directly in front of me was an elephant. He could have been no more than 15 feet in front of me. And make no mistakes, elephants don't like you intruding in their space. I was very frightened. And it wasn't a big elephant, but it was big enough to do me a great deal of harm. And as I saw it so suddenly, I was in the process of lifting my foot to put it down, but I froze, standing there on one leg, wondering who's going to move first, myself or the elephant, and very frightened. And then it occurred to me that the elephant was probably in the same position. Is this crazy monk going to come towards me, or should I go towards him? Anyway, after I recovered from the shock of this sudden encounter very close encounter with this elephant, I was so frightened, I turned around and I ran as fast as I could down the hill, not even stopping to see if the elephant was chasing me, and indeed it was not. That's the closest I've ever been to an elephant. And I was fully aware that I should have been more careful, because had I gone a few steps further without seeing him, he certainly would have caused me great harm, not out of any ill will, but because elephants don't like you intruding into their space. But probably the most engaging encounter I had with elephants was when I was staying in Situpawa, which is somewhere in the middle of the Yala National Park in the southwest corner of Sri Lanka. And Situpawa is the Sri Lankan name for Chitalapabata, which is mentioned in the ancient commentaries. I think it's also mentioned in the Visuddhimagga. And in ancient times, this was famous for being the home of arahats, according to the ancient commentaries. Several famous people deemed to be arahats had lived there. And it is a collection of rock caves around an open area. And it is a very remote place and a very beautiful place. I believe that local tourists often go there now, but when I went there, it certainly wasn't particularly often visited. Anyway, I had spent a few days there, and I decided to walk from there to the coast, which was about 5 or 6 kilometers away, and then walk along the beach to the nearest town, and then return to where I wanted to go. Anyway, with some difficulty, I walked through the forest. There was no tracks, or only slight tracks. And then I got to the beach, and by the time I got there, I was tired and covered with sweat. So I sat under a tree at the edge of the beach on the sand, and I just sat there for a while resting. And after a while, I noticed some movement to my left, and I turned to see an elephant coming out of the jungle, walking down the sandy beach, and then getting into the sea, walking into the sea. And a few minutes later, 3 or 4 other elephants, including 1 or 2 babies, they came down too. At first seemingly cautiously, and then running down into the sea. And to my great astonishment, as I sat there, I saw these 6 or 7 elephants frolicking in the waves. No, none of them had surfboards, but they were clearly enjoying themselves in the sea. Squirting the water over themselves, bumping into each other, and this went on for perhaps half an hour. And then it seems that when they'd finished, they went back up to the sand again, walked along the sand, and disappeared into the forest. And it was such a wonderful thing to see. Some months later, I got to know one of the senior people in the Department of Wildlife, something like that. And I mentioned that experience to him, and he said, "Oh, that couldn't have happened. Elephants don't bathe in the sea." Well, I didn't contradict him, but I know from personal experience that elephants do actually sometimes bathe in the sea. So I just thought I'd share with you some of those delightful experiences I had during my time in Sri Lanka with the wildlife of that wonderful country.